Observational learning, this is 4.7, and this is going to be the last type of learning that we discuss in this unit. So our objective for today is students will be able to explain how observational learning differs from associative learning and how, and this should be, I'm sorry, team, this should go. And how observational learning may be enabled by neural mirroring. So we're going to talk about how neurons mirror things and how that might be playing a role in observational learning. So this is one of the most famous observational learning studies, and this is Albert Bandura did the study, and this is the famous what we call Bobo doll study. And he did this essentially to study observational learning, specifically focused around violence. And so, observational learning, what does that mean? It means that we learn to watch and then what we call imitate. So, it's not just watch, it's watch and imitate the behavior. And then we learning occurs once we actually imitate. So in this Bobo doll study, there was a group of young children, and they were either asked to watch two videos. They either watched a video where an individual was being aggressive to the Bobo doll. So we can see a woman who is hitting and throwing and punching and kicking the Bobo doll. So for those of you that are not familiar with a Bobo doll, it is a clown. It's an inflatable and it has a weight on the bottom, and so you can kind of push it over and it bounces back up. So what they noticed is that after the children watched this video, then when they were put into a room with a Bobo doll, they were more likely to be aggressive with the Bobo doll than children who did not see that same video. Children who did not see that same video just tended to either ignore the Bobo doll or not play with it in as aggressive as manner. So we think mirror neurons may be playing a role in observational learning. And mirror neurons are located in your frontal lobe. And they are responsible for imitation, so imitating behavior, and empathy. Which makes sense that that would be together because empathy is understanding or feelings for what someone else may be going through. So the idea that mirror neurons would be responsible for imitation and empathy makes sense. So this is fascinating. This is a scan of two brains, and the first is a child in pain. And the second is the parent watching their child in pain. And what's so fascinating about this is that the parts of the brain are lighting up for what the child is feeling pain for. And for the parent, we see that very similar parts of the brain are being lit up. Yes, it's not being lit up as dramatically, but it's still being lit up. And this shows us empathy that you actually might feel when you're empathetic. You actually may feel very similar pain to what the other person or what your child may be going through. So in this case specifically, we do think that mirror neurons are responsible for this activity. Even though mirror neurons are in the frontal lobe, so they're in this part of your brain, we think that they're the ones that are passing the messages along to the parts of your brain that are then firing up, in this case for the parent, that represent what the child is going through. And with observational learning, we believe that this could play a role in either what we call prosocial or antisocial behavior. So, prosocial is when we have positive and helpful models. Which then leads to an imitating of positive and helpful behavior. So when we have people, for example, a lot of like athletes or a lot of famous people sometimes get criticized for their behaviors. And this is why, is because even though they're an athlete or a famous person, they're still considered a model, right? And when they don't have good behavior, that can impact. But when they do have good behavior, when we see them do helpful things for the community or helpful things for people, then that can cause imitation of a positive and helpful behavior. We can see that behavior being mirrored, right? So antisocial is going to be when we see negative behavior, which then leads to imitating of negative behavior. And they've done correlational studies. So remember, correlational is just looking at the relationship between two things. So they've done some correlational studies on abusive parents and children. So what they have found with these correlational studies is that there is a positive correlation between abusive parents and then their children being abusive. So it's not a perfect correlation. So I should probably have my dots a little bit more spread out, right? So just because you're in an abusive situation doesn't mean that you yourself will become abusive. There just is a correlation between abusive parents and abusive children. And their thought process behind that is, again, because of this antisocial behavior in the mirror neurons, that this behavior has become a learned behavior. So in summary, for what we discussed today was the idea of observational learning and this idea of imitating the behavior. So observational learning isn't just observing someone, it's observing someone and then imitating that behavior. And we believe that's happening because of mirror neurons in our frontal lobe, which allows us to repeat behaviors that we watch. And in some cases, that's really good, like a pro-social behavior when we see positive, helpful behaviors, but can also be negative when we see things like antisocial behaviors.